You are about to hear the last public words of an American admiral before the military went quiet on this subject for good. It is March 5, 1947. Admiral Richard E. Byrd stands on the deck of the USS Mount Olympus. He tells a reporter the next war will be fought by planes flying, in his own words, from pole to pole with incredible speed. He is not naming Russia, not yet. 2 months earlier, his own fleet had fled Antarctica in terror, 8 months ahead of schedule. Something forced 4,700 men and 13 ships to turn around and run. What did Richard Byrd actually see under the ice? By the end of this video, you will have the real, declassified answer, not the myth. The answer that is stranger than the myth, because every piece of it is true. Before we go back to 1946, tell me one thing. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your city below. I read every single one. And if stories like this are new to you, hit subscribe. We go deep on this channel. Now, let's go back to the mission that was never supposed to end this early. It is August 1946. World War II ended 1 year ago. The Soviet Union is no longer an ally. It is the new enemy, and everyone in Washington knows it. The United States Navy launches Operation Highjump. Its official name is the United States Navy Antarctic Developments Program. Unofficially, it becomes the largest polar expedition ever attempted by any nation, before since 4,700 men, 13 ships, seaplanes, helicopters, icebreakers built to crack a path through ice that had never seen a hull before. This is not a science trip. This is a war exercise wearing a lab coat. The task force is broken into 3 separate groups, approaching the continent from different directions at once, so the Navy can test coordination across an entire theater rather than a single coastline. An aircraft carrier sails with them, a vessel nobody expected to see anywhere near Antarctic ice in 1946. Nothing about the scale of this operation matches the quiet, purely scientific framing the public was given at the time. Rear Admiral Richard E. Byrd is named officer in charge of Task Force 68. He is already a legend by 1946. He has flown over the North Pole. He has flown over the South Pole. But the man actually giving orders to the ships is Rear Admiral Richard H. Cruzen, the task force commander. Byrd is not some minor figure attached to this story for effect. By 1946, he holds the Medal of Honor for his earlier polar flights, and he has spent almost 3 decades building a public reputation as America's most trusted expert on both ends of the planet. That reputation is exactly why his later quote carries so much weight. A nobody saying something strange gets ignored. A Medal of Honor recipient saying something strange gets remembered for 80 years. The public reason for the mission is scientific mapping. The real reason, stated plainly in later military histories, is training men and machines to fight in frozen conditions. The Pentagon expects the next war to be fought across the top of a frozen world against Russia. Crews test how engines start in extreme cold. They test how radios perform when static electricity builds up in dry polar air. They test how long a man can work outdoors before frostbite sets in, and how fast a ship's deck ices over in open water. Every one of these tests is boring on paper. Every one of them is also exactly what a military planning for an Arctic war against the Soviets would actually need to know first. There is a second real reason, one the Navy discusses far less. Washington wants a documented territorial claim in Antarctica staked out before Moscow can plant a flag of its own. Pictures standing on a ship deck built for tropical Pacific patrols now cross seas that freeze solid by nightfall. 4,700 men did not volunteer for this exact assignment. They were ordered into it, and most of them had never seen ice like this in their lives. The fleet reaches the Ross Sea on December 31, 1946. Aerial survey flights begin within days. Pilots are mapping coastline that has never appeared on any chart before that winter. Then, on December 30th, 1 day before the fleet even finishes gathering, disaster strikes first. A PBM Mariner seaplane, Carlson George 1, crashes in a total whiteout on Thurston Island. 3 men die on impact. Ensigns Maxwell A. Lopez, Aviation Radioman First Class Wendell K. Henderson, Aviation Machinist Mate First Class Frederick W. Williams. 2 men survive that crash. Co-pilot William Kearns and pilot Ralph LeBlanc, known to his crew as Frenchie. They lie on the ice for 13 days before a rescue team reaches them. Frenchy LeBlanc will later lose both legs to frostbite. He gives interviews for years afterward, and every account is consistent. Every detail lines up with the official record. These men are real. Their suffering is documented in Navy after-action reports. Nobody needs to invent anything to make this part of the story matter. On January 21, 1947, a fourth man dies. Seaman Vance N. Woodall is killed in a shipboard unloading accident. A routine task turned fatal by ice-slicked decks and exhaustion. 4 deaths in 3 weeks, inside a mission that was supposed to run for 8 months without incident. Compare that number to other polar operations from the same era, and it stands out. 4 fatalities inside the first month of a mapping and training exercise, not a combat deployment, is an unusually high toll for the Navy to absorb quietly. It is one more thread historians point to when they argue the mission was riskier and stranger than its official framing ever admitted. There is a detail worth sitting with here, one that rarely makes it into shorter versions of this story. William Kearns and Frenchy LeBlanc did not simply survive. They gave detailed, consistent testimony for years afterward about the specific conditions on Thurston Island. Whiteout visibility near zero. Temperatures that made metal instruments fail before human bodies did. No search aircraft able to safely fly for the first several days. Their account never once drifts toward anything unexplained. It is a survival story, plain and brutal, and it lines up with every official log from the ship searching for them. That distinction matters for everything that comes later in this video. The real eyewitnesses of Operation Highjump describe cold, exhaustion, and mechanical failure. Nothing more exotic than that. Keep that fact in your mind, because it will matter again very soon. The mission was scheduled to continue at least until June of 1947. Instead, in late February, the entire fleet turned around together and came home early. Officially, the reason given was weather and logistics. But that is not the only explanation people have offered since. And it is not what Admiral Byrd himself told a reporter, only 3 days after the fleet turned back for home, March 5, 1947. The fleet is already steaming north, away from the ice. Admiral Byrd gives an interview aboard the USS Mount Olympus to International News Service reporter Lee Van Atta. The interview runs days later in the Chilean newspaper El Mercurio. This interview is completely real. It is not folklore. It is not a rumor passed between forums. You can locate it in newspaper archives today. And unlike almost everything else you are about to hear, nobody disputes that Byrd actually said these words. Lee Van Atta was a working wire service correspondent, not a fringe writer chasing a strange story. His job was covering a Navy fleet coming home from a real deployment. Nothing more unusual than that. That is part of why the quote carries weight decades later. It did not come from a tabloid. It came from routine, professional wartime-style journalism, filed the same way any troop movement story would have been filed that year. Byrd warns that the United States needs protective measures against, in his words, the invasion of the country by hostile planes coming from the polar regions. He says a future war could bring aircraft capable of flying from pole to pole. At incredible speed, read in plain context, in 1947, this is almost certainly a warning about Soviet bombers. Jet propulsion is brand new technology. The Arctic is the shortest flight path between the Soviet Union and North America. Most professional historians treat this as an ordinary early Cold War statement. Nothing stranger than that. Researchers who later cross-referenced this interview against other high-jump crew statements found something interesting. No other officer on the mission, before or after, is on record using language remotely like Byrd's. Not cruisin', not any of the pilots. Byrd's phrasing stands alone, which is exactly why it gets quoted so much more than anything else from the entire expedition. At the time, the quote barely made a ripple outside Chile. It was picked up by a wire service, printed in one paper, and largely forgotten within weeks. It only becomes famous decades later, once researchers digging through old newspaper archives connect it to the abrupt end of Highjump and start asking why an admiral would phrase a warning that particular way. But ask yourself one question before you move on. Why would a decorated admiral, 3 days off the Antarctic ice, choose the South Pole as his example of a threat to the country when Soviet bombers had no reason to ever fly anywhere near it? That single strange detail is the seed every later legend grows out of, not the diary you may have already heard about. This quote, right here, spoken on the record by a man with his name and rank attached to every word. It is worth repeating because it is easy to lose in a story this layered. Everything strange about this case that actually holds up under scrutiny traces back to one real man, saying one real sentence, in one real interview. Everything that does not hold up traces back to a publisher, decades later, filling in the blanks that real sentence left behind. Here is where the story splits into two completely different paths. And you need to know the difference, because most videos on this exact topic blur the two together on purpose. In 1979, a publisher named Timothy Green Beckley releases a document titled The Missing Diary of Admiral Richard E. Byrd. It claims Byrd flew a secret solo mission in February 1947. According to the diary, Byrd crossed an unnamed mountain range and found a green valley below it, rivers, forests. Even the diary claims a creature resembling a mammoth wandering through the trees. His compass and instruments are said to have failed completely, spinning without direction. The diary goes further than that. It claims Byrd's plane was intercepted mid-flight by disc-shaped aircraft marked with swastika-like symbols. He is forced to land. He meets what the diary calls an advanced civilization, referred to as the Ariani, who warn him about humanity's growing use of atomic weapons and beg him to carry that warning home. Here is the problem with all of it. The diary claims this happened at the North Pole. Byrd was not anywhere near the North Pole in February 1947. He was commanding a fleet at the exact opposite end of the planet, at the South Pole, in the precise location this video has been describing to you for the last 4 minutes. There is no verified original manuscript for this diary. There is no documented chain of custody. No family member of Byrd's has ever produced the physical pages. It surfaces publicly 32 years after the events it claims to describe, from a publisher who specialized almost entirely in occult and paranormal material. Beyond the North Pole era, the diary's writing style does not match Byrd's own documented journals from his real verified expeditions, which read like the technical, understated notes of a career naval officer, not the ornate spiritual prose found in the 1979 document. Handwriting and stylistic analysis by independent researchers has repeatedly failed to connect the two. Say it plainly, because a good investigation has to. The 1979 diary is very likely a manufactured hoax built specifically to profit from Byrd's real fame and his genuinely strange, genuinely real interview. You will find plenty of channels that present the diary as settled fact. None of them show you an original page. None of them can explain the North Pole error. A story does not need a fabricated diary to stay interesting. The documented parts of this case are strange enough on their own, and treating them honestly is what actually earns your trust here, not borrowing drama from a paranormal publisher's 40th anniversary cash grab. But here is what almost no other video on this topic actually addresses clearly. Delete the diary completely. Erase every word of it. You are still left with a real interview, a real early retreat, and 4 real deaths that nobody has ever fully explained. And underneath all of that sits one more layer, one that predates Byrd by nearly a decade. Quick question before we go further. Do you think Byrd's quote was purely about Russia or something else entirely? Comment your answer below. Now, let's look at what happened in Antarctica 8 full years before Byrd's fleet ever arrived. Rewind the clock to 1938. Nazi Germany sends its own Antarctic expedition, a year before the war in Europe even begins. German ships survey a stretch of coastline. Germany formally claims that territory and names it Neuschwabenland. This part is documented, verifiable fact. It is not a legend. German survey ships genuinely charted that coast. The claim genuinely exists on paper. This single confirmed detail becomes the foundation every later legend is built on top of. After the war ends, a rumor begins circulating that surviving Nazi officers escaped to Antarctica and constructed a hidden base, sometimes called Base 211, somewhere inside that same claimed territory. A version of the theory holds that Operation Highjump was secretly sent, under cover of scientific mapping, to locate and destroy exactly that base. There is no declassified document confirming a hidden Nazi base was ever found by any Highjump crew. But notice something important here. This theory did not appear out of thin air. It grew directly out of one confirmed fact. Germany really did survey and claim that land in 1938, 3 years before America even entered the war. Writers who promote the Base 211 theory typically point to the abrupt end of Highjump as their strongest piece of evidence, arguing that a routine mapping trip does not usually end with 4 deaths and an early withdrawal. Historians who reject the theory point out that harsh weather alone has ended plenty of Antarctic operations early, long before and long after 1947, without any hidden base required to explain it. Stop and sit with that for a second. The most convincing conspiracy theories are almost never pure invention from nothing. They usually start with one small, confirmed, verifiable fact, and then several unconfirmed floors get built on top of that single foundation, one story at a time, over decades. Now let's lay out every serious explanation researchers and historians have offered for why Highjump ended early. No verdict yet. Just 4 theories, side by side, and exactly what each one fails to explain. Theory 1. Weather and mechanical failure. Antarctic conditions in 1946 were brutal, poorly mapped, and genuinely lethal to men and machines built for temperate climates. The George I crash alone proves how quickly the continent could kill even trained, experienced pilots. Aircraft engines struggled to start in the extreme cold. Fuel lines froze. Navigation instruments, reliant on magnetic readings, behaved erratically this close to the pole, a well-documented effect with a purely physical explanation. This theory explains the deaths clearly. It does not fully explain why the entire fleet, not only the damaged squadron, packed up and left months ahead of its planned schedule. Theory 2. Shifting Cold War priorities. Some historians argue the Navy extracted the training data and equipment testing it needed within the first several weeks, and simply reassigned its resources toward the faster-growing Soviet threat back home. Budget records from the period support the idea that Arctic-focused programs were gaining priority over Antarctic ones by early 1947. This is the least dramatic explanation available. It is also the one most professional historians quietly lean toward when asked directly. There is a smaller related theory worth naming here too. Extended isolation, 24-hour daylight, and extreme cold are documented to affect human judgment and perception over time. It is possible some individual reports of unusual sightings during Highjump reflect that strain rather than anything external. This does not explain the fleet's early withdrawal on its own, but it is a real physiological factor worth including honestly rather than ignoring. Theory 3. Unknown aerial harassment. Unverified stories, most appearing decades after the mission ended, claim the fleet was harassed by unidentified, flat, disc-shaped craft capable of extreme speed, and that several aircraft were damaged or destroyed as a direct result. Some versions claim a specific number of planes were lost to these encounters, far higher than the documented loss of George I. No official Navy record supports any part of this claim. No named eyewitness account from an actual Highjump crew member has ever been produced under their own real name to confirm it. These stories tend to trace back to second-hand retellings published years or decades after 1947, often citing anonymous sources or sailors who are never fully identified. That does not automatically make the claim false. It does mean it fails the basic sourcing standard every other fact in this video has met so far, and that gap matters. Theory 4. The one that simply refuses to die. Hollow Earth. Older esoteric traditions describe a hidden entrance to an inner world located at both poles, tied to a wider mythology often called Agartha. That mythology predates Byrd, predates the war, predates powered flight itself, circulating in various esoteric and occult circles across Europe and Asia since at least the 19th century. Later 20th century writers folded Byrd directly into that far older mythology, claiming he personally found the entrance and was then ordered into permanent silence about what he found there. It is worth noticing how convenient that timing is. A famous, credible explorer gets attached to a belief system that existed decades before he was ever born, instantly making an old myth feel modern and verified. There is no physical or geological evidence supporting a hollow interior anywhere inside this planet. Modern seismology has mapped the Earth's interior layer by layer in remarkable detail. This particular theory survives for one reason only. It makes an unusually satisfying story, not because it is a supported one. So here is where the real documented story and the popular legend finally meet again, in one exact place 3 days after the fleet turned for home. It is not the diary. It never was the diary. It is something Byrd actually said, under his own name, that serious historians still argue over today. Here is the honest summary of where the evidence actually stands. Operation Highjump happened exactly as described. The deaths happened exactly as described. The El Mercurio interview happened exactly as described, and you can find the clipping yourself if you want to check every word of it. The diary, the swastika-marked discs, and the underground civilization did not come from any of that. They came from a publisher 32 years later, filling in the gaps a real mystery had left wide open. Stay with me here because the next part is the one detail almost no other video on this exact topic explains clearly or in full. If this has been worth your time so far, a like genuinely helps this reach more people who would enjoy it. Now, back to the deck of the Mount Olympus. March 5, 1947, 3 days off the ice. Byrd stands for his interview with Lee Van Atta. This is the exact moment the entire story actually turns on, not a secret diary published decades later. This single, real conversation. Byrd tells the reporter the United States must adopt protective measures against hostile planes attacking from the polar regions. He says such planes could fly from pole to pole with incredible speed, a phrase that gets quoted for the next 80 years. Here is the detail almost every other video skips entirely. Byrd does not say Arctic. He does not name Russia directly, not once in the printed interview. He says polar regions, plural, spoken just days after returning from the opposite pole from anywhere a Soviet bomber would ever actually approach from. The official military explanation is that Byrd simply meant the Arctic, and that new jet propulsion technology made the threat feel closer and more urgent than ever before. That explanation is entirely reasonable. It fits the year perfectly. It fits the politics of the moment perfectly. It is very likely the correct one. But that explanation does not fully account for why a mission planned to run 8 months ended after a little over 6 weeks of actual field operations. It does not account for why 4 men died and a full fleet turned home early from what was billed as a routine training and mapping exercise. It does not account for why, decades later, a portion of Highjump's operational records remain difficult for researchers to access in full even today. None of that proves a hidden Nazi base. None of that proves a hollow world beneath the ice. None of that proves advanced aircraft harassing American pilots. What it proves is smaller, and in some ways stranger than any of that. A real admiral, with a real reputation built over 3 decades of genuine polar exploration, chose his words in a way that trained historians are still actively debating, nearly 80 years after he said them out loud. Researchers who have requested full operational logs from Highjump describe a slow, uneven release process, with some material still marked as withheld or heavily redacted. That alone proves nothing sinister. Routine military records get delayed and lost for mundane bureaucratic reasons all the time. But it is one more small gap in a story built almost entirely out of small gaps, each one too minor to prove anything by itself and too numerous to fully ignore. Freedom of Information requests filed decades later have returned partial logs, weather reports, and casualty paperwork. But researchers still describe entire folders as missing, misfiled, or simply never digitized. Government archivists generally attribute this to the ordinary chaos of post-war record-keeping, not to concealment. Whether you find that explanation satisfying is, at this point, entirely up to you. Just a few months later, in July of 1947, something crashed outside Roswell, New Mexico. An incident that would eventually spawn its own decades-long argument between official explanation and public suspicion. 1947 becomes, for an entire generation of researchers, the year the sky itself seemed to stop feeling safe. Byrd's fleet was already home by then, but the timing is close enough that the two stories get tangled together in popular retellings for decades afterward, even though nothing directly connects them beyond the calendar. Some documentary makers have leaned into that calendar coincidence hard, implying a connection that no released document actually supports. It makes for a dramatic edit. It is not, on the current evidence, an honest one. 11 years after that, in 1958, the United States detonated 3 nuclear weapons high above the South Atlantic and Antarctic region, in a program officially named Operation Argus. Some researchers have asked, without any supporting proof, whether Argus was secretly aimed at something left behind from the Highjump years. There is no declassified document confirming that connection exists. It remains an open question, not a proven answer, and it likely always will. Richard Byrd never gave another public interview expanding on what he saw or did not see beneath the ice that winter. He passed away in 1957, a decorated admiral to the end, without ever adding a single word to that one strange sentence spoken on the deck of the Mount Olympus. So here is where this leaves us after everything. A real fleet, real deaths, 4 of them, all documented. A real admiral who chose one strange, careful sentence on the record, with his own name and rank attached to it. And a fake diary that latched onto that real strangeness 32 years later because the plain truth alone was already interesting enough to sell on its own. Maybe Byrd simply meant Soviet jets, nothing more exotic than that. Most serious historians think exactly that, and they have good reasons to. But maybe the reason this particular story has survived for almost 80 years is that official words, spoken carefully by a man who rarely spoke carelessly about anything, still leave just enough room for one question that nobody has ever fully closed. Strip away the mammoth, the swastika-marked discs, and the underground civilization, and you are still left with something harder to dismiss than any of that. A genuine expedition cut short 4 genuine deaths. And one admiral's carefully chosen sentence, printed under his own name, that the official explanation fits without ever fully closing the door on the stranger one. Stories like this survive for a reason. Not because the paranormal version is true, but because the documented version already refuses to sit still. A fleet that size does not simply turn around for no reason at all. A man like Byrd does not choose his public words carelessly. Somewhere between those two plain facts is where this mystery actually lives, not in a diary from 1979. What do you think Richard Byrd actually meant, standing on that deck in March of 1947? Comment your theory below. I read every single one, and I will reply to as many as I can this week. This story keeps resurfacing every few years, usually around some new anniversary or some newly digitized archive. Each time, a new audience discovers the El Mercurio quote for the first time and asks the exact same question you might be asking right now. That is not evidence of a cover-up. It is evidence that a genuinely strange, genuinely true detail is hard for people to simply let go of, decade after decade. If you want the next investigation, we are heading to a different continent, a different decade, and a mystery that took over 60 years for anyone in an official capacity to even admit was real. Subscribe so you do not miss it when it goes up. I will see you in the next one. Until then, remember the one line that actually matters here. 4,700 men went south. 4 of them never came home, and one admiral, standing on a deck 3 days later, chose his words carefully enough that we are all still talking about them, nearly 80 years on.